Okay, good evening. First of all, I'd like to thank the AA for inviting us so we can speak here, and also to have this opportunity to have the show up there in the bar. It's a great opportunity to actually get the work out of Berlin and exhibit it somewhere else. The lecture tonight complements the show of two Berlin projects hung in the members' bar. It's a good example of ongoing work in our office, which we formed 3 years ago in 1992 in Berlin. My partner and I met at Harvard during graduate school and spent the following years teaching for Cornell University in New York and Rome. Our partnership, unlikely from the outset, matches two polarized sensibilities from virtually opposite backgrounds. Frank, from the American West, Montana, and mine from southern Germany. Despite our overlap at Harvard, my education was aligned with the German-Swiss reductionism, where Frank's training instilled a kind of Jesuit-inspired mysticism. We like to think that these impulses contribute to a creative tension or a dynamic, which in fact often approaches terror, character assassination, and that sort of thing. So, how do I turn the light off? Lured by opportunities to build in Berlin, we arrived in a city familiar to me, utterly unfamiliar to Frank, in the throes of a manic rebuilding of itself. While the forces which contribute to the making of a boom town, politics, economics, war, and enterprise, vary, the dynamics rarely change, whereby uncertainty, debate, factionalism, and rapid retrenchment characterize. Growth, which occurs under normative conditions over generations, is compressed into cycles as short as 5 or 10 years. The city planning department's argument in Berlin for a homogeneous city seeks to legitimize the fiction of an unbroken history, given rise to form intended to connect the city, an architecture of appearances rather than of possibilities. Certainly, Berlin's power to compel is characterized by its discontinuity, its dissonant adjacencies. The New York Times has recently described Berlin as seen from afar like some kind of forbidden fruit, a garden of dazzling creativity, utter evil, and constant redemption. Despite a culture which produced astonishing forms this century through modernism and expressionism, public policy now argues for an historical utopia under the guise that Berlin must look like Berlin. But which appearance is authentic or preferable? In a democratic, unified Germany, post-war Sharon can be cited as plausibly as Schinkel as representing those aspirations. Although a public debate argues for a correct mapping of the city, progress demands implementation. Certainly in Berlin, under these circumstances, a production of architecture is allowed within the sovereignty of the discipline, whereas our generation in the US is further marginalized toward a kind of architectural hyphenation, where pairings such as architect-artist, architect-fashion designer, architect-filmmaker, or architect-choreographer suggests an expansion of architects' authority to make claim for external disciplines, both as survival and to expand itself beyond perhaps its own exhausted boundaries. If only temporarily, Berlin and other growth areas in Europe allow a maintenance of architect as architect within the historical framework of its production. R.E. Somol, citing Colin Rowe, speaks of the earlier 20th century notion of European idea and American fact, as illustrated by the gridded structure as essential idea and theoretical statement, as opposed to American fact in the form of the built office building. With this observation, Somol goes on to suggest its contemporary reversal, whereby today it is the younger Europeans who have the opportunity to build in much greater numbers, while their New World counterparts underemployed and overeducated, have apparently, perhaps necessarily, continued to concentrate on more theoretical experimentations. However, while the opportunity to build has never been greater in Berlin, the search for the correct representation of a Germany in transition is unclear. Fact and idea seems estranged as never before. A pre-war reading of America was presented by an informed European eye through Corbusier's Vers une Architecture and Mendelssohn's Amerika. These analyses advocated a neue Sachlichkeit as represented in the industrial modernism of an expanding America, which was to bloom after the war through building programs conceived by immigrant refugees architects like Mies, Hilbersheimer, and Mendelssohn. As later day, we strive to maintain our own external American background education informed reading of Berlin rather than comply with the internal debate that is led by Mr. Stimmen, who some of you might have heard of. The architectural competition, while often merely a means of implementing public policy, is still perhaps the best forum for alternative position. Its role as a progressive vehicle is immediately hindered, however, because experimentation is not generally encouraged. Certainly, the competition format has the best chance of serving both idea in the form of proposals and fact through the intended production, the building, of the selected project. Yet, its corruption in the Berlin arena we see in mediocrity serving stated public goals rather than in a critical culling of ideas. The slide on the right shows the Potsdamer Platz, which is probably the biggest construction site right now in the city, and it is supposed to look like that in the year 2010. And what you see on the left is a building by Savade, who is I don't know how well known he is in England. In Berlin, he's one of the most important architects right now, and he's building. This is a building on Friedrichstraße. With the rapid architectural closure of the Berlin center, opportunities for investigation shift to the periphery, geographically within the boundaries of the former East Germany. As outlined in Frank's introduction at the beginning of the year, extensive industrial tracts, housing and infrastructure built by the former DDR is largely being appropriated or destroyed through reunification. Spoils of war, their fate is determined by their new owners. Valuation, typically economic rather than cultural, determines that which will remain. Maintenance assumes the dual role of both returning decaying buildings to utility and appropriation, redefining their status. The new facades of the Plattenbau, the plate building, housing blocks on the Leipziger Straße, which you see on the slides, have as much to do with the cultural appropriation as with restoration. Utopian modernism, as condemned in Stalin's warnings of the dangers of the Bauhaus, is displaced by commercial Western modernism. This sleight of hand occurs with the least means, representation made through new appearances for public consumption. Program, occupancy, plan, and space remain the same. Our position toward our work in these territories outside of the debate of the center is to argue a synthetic response to these conditions. Programmatic drifting, critical remodeling, and aggressive maintenance characterize operations which intensify existing architectures and infrastructures beyond a mere correction of the surface. Now we'll show a few examples of our own work and the work we've been working on lately. What you see on the slides here is, you make it worse, is also part of the show you see upstairs in the bar. There was an invited competition a year ago for 2 kindergartens, and we actually won that competition. I have to mention one thing in the audience is Douglas Gauthier, who collaborated with us on this project. As I said, an invited competition we won last year for 2 projects in Berlin. Buchholz, that's the part of town it's called. You see on those slides. The development of the Berlin periphery is implemented through a much more dense urbanization than its counterpart, the American suburb. Within a master-planned housing complex for about 5,000 units, the brief asks for a prototypical design for 9 daycare centers within the larger scheme. The overall scheme inserted into the former agricultural periphery makes denser housing at the edge of the city, creating a circuity of 6-storied housing blocks. The 9 Kitas dispersed through the Wohnsiedlung were to be systematically designed so that within an order that was dimensionally, materially, and functionally similar, variation could be developed. Given the potency of the ground plane in Berlin, where traces of the shifting history of the last 50 years are almost always present, our initial response was to create a counter-ground-based relief system. This idea of the ground plane and working with the landscape goes also back to work or project we've been working on before. The slide on the left is a very old project that was a Shinshinchiku entry. We entered it, I think, five years ago when we were finalists. And on the right, you see a project for Berlin for the one single piece, actually, of the Berlin Wall that's left. It's a 209-meter-long piece of the Berlin Wall that's left, and the competition was to design a memorial for that, Bernauer Straße. As an extension of early investigations, such as our project for another glass house, which you see on the left, or the memorial of the Berlin Wall in Bernauer Straße, the ground plane became the principal surface. The glass house project proposed an architecture mimetic of an existing ground plane, and the Bernauer Straße project presented an artificial landscape to reattach the wall as a fragment back to its immediate context. The marking of its surfaces recall the unmarked dead of the cemetery in the foreground, since the grave markers were removed during the building of the death strip during the construction of the wall. Now we're going back to the Kitas. This is as I said, we won actually 2 of those buildings, and this is the first one, bigger one. The relief system for the Kitas, located with the residual open spaces of the Siedlung, will be programmed by playing surfaces and landscape for the children of the community as an activity zone. It will be legible as such through tactile material change by dislocating it in height from the elevation of the Siedlung. Upon this system, the Kitas will be located. Once the markings of these relief systems were identified, the local sites of the project began to activate possibilities for the forms of the structures themselves. Our landscape architects proposed groups of landscape and boundary walls which mediate between the relief system and the forms of the buildings. Mimetic of the forms of the buildings, they negotiate between the ground plane and the structures. The buildings organize into a series of parallel elements forming a center circulation entry space, which is connected upon the circuit of the relief system to all 9 kindergartens. I'm sorry they came out a little pale. You can see them much better upstairs. Functionally, similar, the articulation of the bands reacts to site specificity, orientation, light, and access. The central double-height circulation space became a kind of interstitial space between the bands. The major band to the south contained large group rooms with adjacent auxiliary rooms. These spaces are intended to be expandable into one another. The second band contains cloakrooms and storage. The third is the entry space, and the fourth to the north contains offices and toilet cores. After the competition, we were asked to design the second kindergarten as a youth center, which pretty much meant that we had to blow out all the group rooms and provide larger spaces for discotheques and multi-purpose rooms and things like that. And of course, everything had to be acoustically isolated. This is also, this project is fairly typical for Berlin work right now because the budget is very, very small, very minimal. And therefore, in response to the minimal budget, the structure consists of a conventional concrete columns and slabs, infilled with tile masonry units making up for like a really inexpensive core. Roof and facade systems are metal, fiber cement panels, translucent insulation panels, and wood windows, constituting cheap but variable systems which alter the two buildings' principal south facades. Perspectives also.
I mean, this would be indicative of some of the spaces inside this residual space to the main that entry circulation hall, as well as this kind of the bands. The perspective on the right that kind of cut off, extruded section ending at these layers of bars. Additional projects that we've been looking at in the periphery also include the renovation work, I should say, in Adlershof. Adlershof is a 150-year-old research complex that was the site of Europe's first airfield. Later, in the 20th century, the Nazis expanded the facilities in the 30s for the testing of aircraft parts and for Werner von Braun's rockets. The initial, a lot of the V2 research occurred out here. Not unlike the forms of the American Neue Sachlichkeit, Adlershof consists of structures whose astonishing forms corresponded functionally to the operations they housed. For example, vertical and horizontal wind tunnels, which are these two structures here, hangars, laboratories, and power stations. Adlershof in the late 30s remained one of the last acceptable sites in Germany, along with the German Autobahn, for a Bauhaus-oriented modernism to be realized under the auspices of technical functionalism. So, again, this is one of the last places this was incorporated through those building programs. The state architecture at this time was characterized by the public works of Albert Speer and Marsch, who'd done the stadium. And at Adlershof, this other German or the Germanic architecture appeared, this Blood and Boden architecture, or blood and floor, or blood and ground architecture made its strongest appearance in this sort of Gemütlichkeit, or a kind of domestic architecture which appears in the cantina on the left, which is in the administration building. So that would, in a sense, be indicative of that other sort of sensibility coming through the German architecture at that time. After the war, under the DDR, Adlershof was used both as a research park and university. Architectures of both political systems, fascist and communist, existed or still exist today side by side in a kind of schizophrenic claim jumping. The current programming of the park calls for educational and research facilities to kind of expand on this park for the private sectors. Let's see. I should go back one. Our initial project here was to reprogram the existing entrance pavilion built by the Nazi government in 1936, which is this piece far on the right, that entrance pavilion or border house as they call it. The problem was to represent the pavilion from a control point to the park to an access point for information, in a sense, an information pavilion. The central aspect of the Nazis' design was the construction of a pedestrian tunnel which enables secreting documents across the Rue d'Auer Chaussee, which is this major traffic arterial in front, which splits the research park into north and south tracks. Our proposal was to reverse this reading of the existing structure, thereby an architecture of control is meant to be an architecture of sort of representing a notion of access to information and resources. Counter to the position of Berlin's planning authorities' definition of public space as a street-oriented promenade, we proposed to excavate the structure, exposing the tunnel and ramping from the adjacent park area to the basement level below for use as a bistro. When this initial proposal was rejected as anti-public, again, this idea of a kind of archaeological excavating of the site where these tunnels and some of these other, the tunnel running underneath this new tower piece, somehow revealing some of that information as equally valid histories to the new argument, city planning, which argues for a kind of public space being more ground plane oriented or street oriented. These are earlier proposals here with this excavation, which paralleled the street here, sort of as well as the excavation of the tower itself. We concentrated on the tower, which would act as a light chimney sectionally for the tunnel below while serving as a marker for the new entrance. A series of punctures will bring natural and artificial light to the tunnel. The entrance to the pavilion is a bridge which crosses the void over the tunnel to the core of the pavilion, which consists of a bistro or restaurant, information area, and office. The tower, which we're developing right now with Arup, is a steel frame inserted into the width of the tunnel. This is, of course, the tunnel here. Sectionally, that tunnel is operating on that slide on the right that way, with the new tower sort of inserted into that space. The tunnel will be clad with 10mm translucent stone panels, which layer over each other in vertical bands within the depth of the structure. An LED light band was asked for to serve as an events calendar at the top of the tower. Despite the architecture's comparatively simple technology compared to other things they're developing out here, like lasers, computer technology, the client asked for this building to have an expression of innovation, which at this point is occurring to the development of these facade systems. As we mentioned earlier, the ambition was to create a critical refiguring of the existing structure, where at both the level of detail and space, the dialogue extends the possibilities of the architecture through an intensification rather than, again, this question of reappropriation. This on the left is an example of the facade system that we're developing in the stone systems, which are layering back to this structural steel frame. Further projects at Adlershof include restoration and extension of the central heating plant and new turbine hall, which is much more kind of renovation type job. Within the realm of Berlin must look like Berlin, industrial architecture is in any case is left to a degree to its own devices. While Steiner's Berlin, a Berlin of stone, is deemed the correct expression for public architecture, industrial architecture is allowed its sort of traditional rendering in steel and glass and that kind of materiality. Our response to the reskinning of the existing central plant is to provide a surface relief in terms of a patchwork of variable metals and glass advancing and receding within 50 centimeter depth of the new facade. The new turbine hall, which is an extension, the old power plant is the building behind. The new turbine hall deemed, well, somewhat, again, by the city, deemed negatively as a kind of cathedral. Certainly not the first time that metaphor has been used. will use a similar cladding system. The system extends vertically, wrapping the existing exhaust chimneys. The chimneys will be wrapped in steel frames with an open steel mesh skin. In a technological park where airplane hangars are built in the form of airplane wings, our proposal was determined to be a little too expressionistic, so they were really looking for this kind of, although it is industrial, looking for a kind of massiveness or this kind of monumentality about it, rather than this, which they determined in a negative sense to be too ephemeral or too light. Shifts to built work began with the construction of an apartment, office, and retail building in Berlin. This is not Periphery. This is a much more central site here. Given the demand for housing in reunited Berlin, social housing was a likely first project. The building typical for Berlin is hybrid, stacking cars, commerce, business, and living over each other. The discussion for public space argues for an intensification through mixed use. As consistent with the Berlin Building Code of 1897, the structure grafts the broken block back together, continuing the street line and holding the 22-meter building height. The empty site is the result of Allied bombing, or it's called a Bauloch, during the war, as is the norm now in Berlin due to accidents in the last few years of the building boom. Site works typically begins with a thorough search for unexploded 500 bombs, which often are found in these kinds of sites. The project was solved sectionally by connecting the new structure through a 2-story deep parking garage, which you can see on the section on the left, connecting to a new roof apartment in the existing apartment house in the courtyard. The problem was also to a range of apartment types for social housing that would still fall under the guidelines for the project's financial backers, who called for a kind of 19th century apartment types as the best solution for rentable social housing. So it was struggling with some of these sort of planning decisions, which are also determined by outside agencies often also. The response was to organize plans with internally flexible spaces and to alter the plans in response to the street facade, which was also hybridized in response to the varying programs. The facade will comprise of steel and wood windows. Somewhat surprised at the limits of technological possibilities in Germany, the structural frame is made up of the relatively higher tech or higher technology steel reinforced concrete slabs and shear walls, infilled by a typical tile masonry unit infill, which is used for 100 years. Our structural engineer determined the layout of the varying fields of material which puzzle together, forming the facade surface. Perhaps more particular to building in Europe is the possibility of adjusting the project during construction. Rather than via extensive procedures for change orders, alteration can be made often on the site, sketching directly over construction drawings, or as Beatrice Comina's recent observation cites Loos's inclination to change projects on the site, having less confidence in architectural representation as the final means of determining architecture's production. We found also on the construction site that decisions affecting the design of the project carry well through construction phase, whereas Rafael Maneo has pointed out recently that when buildings enter into the realm of materiality, they become much more unpredictable. There's always some degree of unpredictability affected by material in the work of the architect. In this moment, the transference occurs that brings building from drawings to reality. And Maneo talks about the excitement of that possibility, the unpredictableness of that, but also the excitement in terms of those kinds of episodes or occurrences. Another project, another industrial project that we were working on or just recently completed is the completion of this 32,000 square foot addition to a German laser cutting machine tool company in Connecticut, in America. Sited within 1 hour of New York, the surrounding area is a typical office park setting. And nearby stands this sort of located in an 18th century colonial village called Farmington, which is adjacent to it. The brief asked for the addition to provide a new public entrance for the client's office space, a demonstration hall for the machines, and clean rooms for laser testing. The addition connects directly to the existing rambling one-story production hall. Our solution was to use the entrance and demonstration hall to bridge the two structures. So this company builds these kinds of machines, which are laser steel cutting tools. So one of our agendas was somehow to use these tools in terms of producing the building itself, to bring that as a kind of, use that technology in the relatively low tech of the building. The addition is off to the left, past this being the new entry core here, the new extension off to the left here. Again, the client had asked for an architecture that was both sympathetic to the existing building, but would express further the technology of the products they produce. This meant combining $70 a foot, which is quite cheap, mini-mall building technology with practically the world's most precise metal cutting and forming machines. An irony not lost upon us with the technological advance of the industrial products which we were building this structure for. The parallel advancement with industrial architecture is not always up to par. So in fact, with buildings like this, gone are the structural sections of Albert Kahn's Ford Motor Plant or Barron's AEG turbine hall from early in this century, where architectural technology advanced in step with the industrial technology it was designed to house. For our project, the factory now in a sense is a warehouse, and the technology ends up drifting into facade systems, finishes, stairs, and fixtures. Architecture at the level of detail peculiar to this project can be characterized by incredibly precise stainless steel infill panels of tolerances of 1 millimeter inserted into welded steel frames of almost unacceptably crude quality, which the steel work under here housing these. Somewhere rather unexpectedly, there though appeared a dynamic between these two technologies. Other sites which appeared during the project were extensive built-in and freestanding storage and furniture groups also produced using both technologies. Laser-cut light deflectors are driven typically by $20 off-the-shelf fluorescent fixtures. Told that we were just scratching the surface of what the machines can do, we hope to advance or sort of research this technology on further projects for this client. So this is the typical view from underneath that entrance roof here on the left, and on the right is a view of that entrance hallway for the public. And just finally, this is some recent work which we produced in the last couple of weeks. Is also this is a German project in Brandenburg, which is indicative of most of the competition work that's happening now, as an addition to a courthouse, which is this existing sort of hulk of a building in the background. Again, a kind of ground-based system for inserting these new courtrooms into this sort of platform surface, which would be used for various trial processes. On the right is the entry platform, and underneath is a typical view of one of these courtrooms in this relatively low density portion of Brandenburg. Okay, thank you.
well, perhaps we can do it less formally in the past.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thanks.